Hi, this is Daniel with TrustGraph, and today I'm going to show you our new agent flow features that just launched in 0.15.6. It's much easier to configure these agents in the configuration editor, and that's what we're looking at right now. And I've already gone through this process. I already have TrustGraph up and running because I really want to talk through how to configure the agent flow and why it works the way it does. So we can see I've chosen Docker. The Docker engine is already running. I'm using Google AI Studio, Cassandra, Quadrant. I did token chunking, 1000, and the typical what we do is 5% overlap. We're using Gemini 1.5 Flash, a temperature 0.3, and I just did close to the maximum output for Gemini, which is technically 8,192, but I mistyped it so many times, I just put 8,000. Of course, if we come to customization, we can see we can customize the prompts and also this new tab, the agent definitions. So if we go to the configure prompts, we'll see a standard system prompt, which I've actually modified for this particular case to make it a little bit more generic. Uh, we're working on a new release where the system prompts can be set separately from the data extraction prompts versus the agent flow. But in this current version, they're all using the same system prompt. So I went with the one that's a little bit more generic, asking the LLM to respond accurately and thoughtfully. And I use that word thoughtfully because of the React style agent process. All of these prompts or you should be familiar with now. These are just the data extraction prompts and how we query the graph and the vector stores. This one is new though. This one may look a little complex as well because this is the actual prompt that creates the agent flow. And we're using a little bit of some templating here in the Python code. And we can go all through this in a little bit more detail a bit later. But for now, there's no need for you to edit any of this unless you're making some really big changes to how this agent flow works. Here, and now I've already done these, you'll have different tools that you can configure for the agent flow. So what do we mean when we say a tool? Right now we have two primary options for a type of tool. It can be a GraphRAG query, or it can be just a text completion. So a GraphRAG query means this is the intent to query the graph stores and the vector databases for knowledge that you've already extracted so that the agent flow is thinking, I need to find more information to fulfill this request. So I'm going to use a query to the graph stores. When you do that, the way this works is that this is just an internal ID. This is the name of the actual tool within the agent flow. And this is kind of the instruction. So here we're telling it, if somebody's asking about the Challenger disaster, this is going to trigger that, well, I need to know more information about the Challenger disaster. So I'm going to trigger this graph query. And this is just what is going to get passed to the LLM in every case. So this is just the search query for the Challenger disaster. In this case, I wanted to actually perform some risk analysis and risk reports around this the Challenger disaster. So I've created this flow around these particular tools. This one actually is going to perform a risk analysis. As you can see, it's going to perform a risk analysis with a likelihood and severity of a possible event. And in this case, I'm wanting it to pass it a likelihood and severity. And here, this is where I wanted to generate a risk report. And what would be passed to the risk report would be, an analysis. So it actually takes the risk analysis and does the risk report. And as always, you come here, we would, I've already generated it, I've already downloaded it, and this is actually already running. So we come here, we can see, if I go back a little bit farther in time, we can see where we've been doing the extraction. We can see this was the histogram of the chunking. We can see our token throughput. You can see that what models we're using. We're only seeing the errors because we don't actually have this model in the price list because technically Google's technically not charging for it right now. So that's why it's not in the price list. So we can show that we do have data in the graph. We have close to 10,000 edges. It's quite a lot. And if we want to look at what some of those are, and this is only going to, this is, we're not going to show all of them, this is just some, we can see the different kind of data that's in the graph store. It's quite a lot. So let's just do a typical GraphRAG query. So let's just do this. We're going to query GraphRAG. I'm going to say, write a risk report on the failure. Well, let's do it this way. Let's risk report on the O-ring, because again, this is the NASA Challenger, so we know the O-ring is important. Write a risk report on the O-ring failure per the Rogers Commission report. So this is just going to query, this is going to do a GraphRAG query and then do a generative response. So we can see the response. It's not particularly a report. It's just kind of like, it's just one paragraph. So what happens though, if we invoke the agent flow? I'm going to set the verbose flag -v, which is going to give us all the internal thought process of the agent. And we're going to do the same thing. Write a risk report on the O-ring failure per the Rogers Commission report. Now, this is going to be a longer process because we're going to go through this process deconstructing in a React style flow that's going to think step by step. So I think, okay, so what we did right there is we got some information about the O-ring, and we've now got this report, which looks very much like a report. We see an executive summary, we see the risk analysis, because I had specified to perform the risk analysis with a likelihood and severity that could either be high, medium, or low. And then we get this full report based on, I had said the audience was executive decision makers. So we see recommendation, then we see a conclusion. So much more what we would expect when we say, I want a risk report. Now let's try something else. Let's try something that might not really be in this data set and see what's happened. So let's do query GraphRAG, write a risk report on the political implications of the Challenger disaster for the Rogers Commission. I've always met, I think it's that way. Well, we'll just go with that way. I can never remember. So here we see we don't really have any information on that because the Rogers Commission report isn't a political report. So we didn't really get much information on that. So, but what if we go to the agent? What do we get? So let's do the same thing. Let's see what happens if we think through that. So how would I write a risk report? So we're seeing a very different process now. One of the things that's really interesting about this, especially from an explainability perspective, we're all of a sudden seeing, we're actually getting this information. We're seeing that the agent flow is saying, well, this information isn't really in the knowledge base. That the only political implication mentioned is this one, is this executive order. And we keep seeing this multiple times. So even though we get a very similar output, we get tremendous insight into why we got this input. We can actually see that we're getting information where I can actually see that the Rogers Commission report didn't really talk about the political implications of it. So when I get this response, well, it's not because, well, the LLM just did a bad job or we did a bad job of querying the graph. We can now see why this is a response. We can now see like, oh, this information isn't really in this report. I need more information. And that's one of the power, that's really some of the power that we see with this agent flow, especially when you put it on verbose mode. This really is unlocking the door from the potential for what we're calling explainable AI, so that when you get an output, you actually know where that output came from.